The soft hum of alien machinery filled the dimly lit chamber as Valera, a high-ranking scientist of the Eason tribe, stood motionless, staring at the glowing holographic data before her, her olive green skin glimmered under the pale blue light as she traced the lines of information with slender fingers here. Curiosity piqued for decades, the Ezen had considered human breeding abilities to be mere myth, a laughable fable whispered among the elder women, but what Valera saw in front of her now defied that mockery. She was known for her pragmatism, for the cold logic that dictated every decision she made, and yet the undeniable pull of the data suggested something primal and untapped within her species, a possibility here scientific mind was unprepared to reconcile. She flicked her silver-white hair over her shoulder, the strands gleaming like silk in the faint light, her brows furrowed in disbelief. Evidence was clear. Human males had some sort of biological compatibility with Ezen females, something that had never been observed in any other species. The graphs and numbers spoke of reproduction, potential of genetic fusion, and the creation of life. Her heart pounded with each pulse of the hologram, filling her chest with an unsettling mixture of fear and intrigue. She tapped on the interface, magnifying the image of a human male, a specimen labeled Subject 237. His muscular frame was foreign to her, the broad shoulders, rough skin, and unrelenting gaze triggering a strange sensation deep within her. The Ezen males were elegant, slender, their smooth bodies more akin to flowing streams of light. This human, there was something raw, untamed, and frighteningly compelling about him. Valera felt the tightness in her chest deepened. She shook her head and stepped away from the console, needing space to breathe, to think. The chamber was cold, sterile, like every scientific room on the Ezen mothership, but now it felt stifling. She wasn't prepared to entertain the notion that humans could fulfill the one aspect her species struggled with: successful reproduction. Every attempt had failed. Despite the technological superiority, Ezen females had long faced a gradual decline in fertility, their once thriving civilization now teetering on the brink of extinction. This is absurd, she muttered to herself, pacing the room, her flowing robes brushing the metallic floor, but the words felt hollow in the empty space. Her thoughts were too loud, drowning out the rationality she usually relied on. There was no denying the data, no escaping the truth. A sharp knock echoed from the door, breaking through her inner turmoil. Valera straightened, composing herself before turning to the frame. Dressed in the dark blue uniform of the council commander, Valera, he greeted, his voice crisp, but carrying an undertone of reverence. "What is it, Mizar?" Valera asked, her tone sharper than intended. Mrs. Violet eyes flickered with something unreadable. "The council requests your presence. They've reviewed your findings on the human subjects. They wish to proceed with the next phase." Valera's breath caught. The next phase? "You mean they want you to perform the experiment?" he confirmed, stepping closer. His gaze lingered on her, probing for a reaction, but Valera kept her face an emotionless mask. "They believe your expertise and personal dedication make you the perfect candidate." Her stomach churned. Personal dedication? Was that a veiled insult, a nod to her recent obsession with this project? She couldn't deny that she had been the driving force behind it, but now that the moment had come, now that she was expected to participate in an actual breeding session with a human male, doubting nod at her, Valera turned away from Mysore, staring blankly at the holographic data. Again, the image of Subject 237 loomed large, his eyes boring into her, making her feel exposed in ways she didn't understand. "I need time," she murmured, her voice wavering for the first time in years. "There is no more time, Tiowa Masar," said his tone softening. "Our species depends on this, on you." The weight of his words pressed down on her shoulders, making her feel smaller, more fragile than she'd ever felt. She'd always been the strong one, the logical one, but now the reality of what was being asked of her was too much. She was expected to lay with a human, to allow him to go inside of her, as the humans called it, and prove once and for all that this myth of breeding could save them. Her mouth went dry. "I don't know if I can." Mysore stepped forward, his hand hovering near her shoulder before retracting. "You have always been the strongest of us. You must face this fear for all of us." Valera swallowed hard, her throat tight as her mind raced. Her fingers twitched at her sighed the ghost of a touch she hadn't felt before, the touch of a human. She clenched her fist, trying to steady herself. "Tell the council I will prepare," she said finally, her voice a whisper. Mizar nodded, relief evident in his expression. "We'd be ready when you are." As the door slid shut behind him, Valera collapsed into the nearest chair, her body trembling with an unfamiliar sensation. Dread. She had faced countless dangers in her career, encountered hostile alien races, stared down death itself. But this was different. This was personal, intimate, in a way she could barely comprehend. Her gaze drifted back to the hologram, to the image of Subject 237. His eyes seemed to see right through her, as though he knew what was to come, as though he had been waiting for this moment as long as she had been denying it. Valera shuddered, the fear bubbling beneath her skin. But there was something else there too, a flicker of anticipation, of a dark curiosity. She wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Her breath quickened as she stood, her decision made. She would meet this human, she would see if the myths were true, because if they were everything she thought she knew about herself, about her species, about the universe, would change forever. Valera stood in front of the thick glass partition, staring at the human male on the other side. He was restrained, hands bound to a chair, his chest bare beneath the dim light that cast long shadows over his muscular form. His breathing was slow but controlled, his eyes flicking up to meet hers through the glass. The intensity in his gaze made her stomach twist in a way she hadn't expected. He was different. The other specimens they had brought and had been malnourished, frail compared to their Ezen counterparts. But this one was solid, a fighter. His skin was marred with scars, a testament to battles fought and survived. His jaw was clenched in defiance, but there was a curiosity in his eyes, too, a recognition of the strangeness of his situation. Valera's breath hitched, and she pressed her hand to the glass, feeling the cold surface under her palm. For a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin against her own. It was an unsettling thought, one she pushed away immediately. The door to the observation room slid open, and Mizar stepped inside, his eyes quickly surveying the scene. "It's time," he said, his voice firm but low, as if afraid of disturbing the moment. Valera tore her eyes away from the human and turned to face Mizar. She had spent the entire night preparing herself, mentally running through the logistics of the experiment over and over again, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of what was about to happen. "How do I even begin?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, betraying her uncertainty. Mizar's face softened, a rare occurrence for someone as stoic as him. "You are not alone, Valera. You are the best of us, and you will find a way." She nodded, though the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. She had to remember why she was doing this: for her people, for the survival of their species. This was not about her personal fears or discomforts. It was about the future of the Ezen. With a deep breath, she stepped toward the door that led into the chamber where the human was being held. The door slid open, and as she stepped inside, the sound of her footsteps echoed against the sterile metal floor. The human's eyes followed her every move, unblinking, calculating his posture, though restrained, radiated strength, readiness to act if the opportunity arose. She could feel his energy in the air, a silent tension building between them as she approached. "You're not afraid of me," Thea said softly, more to herself than to him, her eyes scanning his face. "Should I be?" he responded, growly but clear. His accent was strange, unfamiliar, but there was no mistaking the edge in his tone. It was the voice of someone who had faced death before and wasn't about to cower before anyone. Alien or not, Valera hesitated. This was the first time she had ever spoken directly to a human. She had read reports, observed them through screens, but to stand here now, to hear his voice, to feel the weight of his presence, it was unnerving. "You're here for an experiment," she said, her voice steadying as she began to fall back into the role she knew best: scientist, observer, detached. "Your body possesses something we believe is necessary for our survival. You may not understand this, but you are important." He chuckled darkly, his lips curling into a smirk. "Important, huh? Is that why you've got me tied up like some lab rat?" Valera's brow furrowed. She hadn't expected such boldness from him. But there was a resilience in his words that intrigued her. Most subjects, when they realized the gravity of their Situation grew fearful, compliant, but not this one, you misunderstand, she said, her tone clipped, trying to maintain control of the situation. This is for your safety. If we are wrong, if your body reacts vehemently, we need to be able to control it. His smirk faded, and for the first time his gaze softened slightly. And what happens if you're right? He asked, his voice dropping lower, a hint of vulnerability breaking through his heart. And exterior Valera didn't answer immediately. She stepped closer, standing just a few feet from him now, her eyes locking with his for a moment. The sterile chamber, the restraints, the coldness of the situation, all of it faded. It was just him and her, two beings from different worlds staring into the unknown. If I'm right, she whispered, you will save an entire species, my people. You will be remembered as a hero. He was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. And what do I get out of it? The question caught her off guard, and she blinked momentarily, unsure how to respond. What do you want? She asked cautiously. Lee, the silence stretched between them, heavy and thick with anticipation. His eyes darkened, his muscles tense as if bracing for something. Freedom, he said finally, his voice like a growl. I want my freedom. Valera's heart skipped a beat. Freedom, it was such a simple word, and yet it carried so much weight. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw more than just a subject. She saw a man, someone who had his own hopes, his own fears, his own desires. He wasn't just a tool to be used, he was alive just as she was. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, and suddenly everything felt different. She had come here with the cold detachment of a scientist, but now she wasn't sure if she could follow through. The room felt too small, the air too thick. She took a step back, her chest tight with the conflicting emotions raging inside her. I can't promise you that, she said quietly, hating the way the words felt on her tongue, but I promise I will try. His gaze softened for the briefest of moments before hardening again. Latoon, get this over with. Then Valera nodded, though the weight of what was about to happen settled heavily on her shoulders. She turned to the control panel on the wall and deactivated the restraints. The metal clasps hissed as they released, and for the first time, Subject 237 stood freely in front of her. He rubbed his wrists where the restraints had held him, his eyes never leaving hers. There was not anger in his gaze, now only determination. Valera's heart raced as she stepped closer to him. Her fingers hovered over his skin, inches from his bare chest. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the raw power of his body, so different from anything she had ever known. I don't know if this will work, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither do I, replied, his voice low and rough. Her hand trembled as she finally made contact, her fingertips brushing against the warmth of his skin. The sensation sent a shiver through her entire body, the softness of his flesh juxtaposed with the strength beneath it. Valera sucked in a sharp breath, her body reacting in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had been trained for this, had prepared herself for the clinical detachment necessary for the experiment, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of feeling that came with his touch. Her breath quickened, and she could see his chest rise and fall in time with hers. The space between them seemed to evaporate, their bodies inching closer. Without either of them realizing it, he lifted a hand, his fingers tracing along her jawline, the touch gentle as if testing her limits. Her skin tingled under his touch, the sensation spreading like fire through her veins. Valera's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to be intimate, and yet as she gazed into his eyes, she realized that there was no turning back. Valera stood frozen, her hand resting on the human's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath beneath her fingertips. The heat of his body seared into her skin, the sensation both foreign and intoxicating. His gaze was locked on hers, intense, piercing, and filled with something she couldn't name for a moment. The purpose of the experiment, everything she had trained for, blurred in her mind. She was no longer the cold, calculated as in scientist. She was something else. Something she didn't understand. The human's hand, still tracing the line of her jaw, moved slowly, testing as though seeking permission. His fingers grazed her neck, the light touch sending shivers down her spine. Her body reacted, involuntarily betraying the calm facade she tried to maintain. Valera inhaled sharply, her chest tightening as his thumb brushed against her collarbone, igniting a fire in her core that she couldn't ignore. This is not what I expected, she whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. The human's lips twitched into a faint smirk, but his eyes remained serious, darkened by something primal. Neither did I, he muttered, his voice as if the words struggled to make their way out. There was an unspoken understanding between them, now a silent acknowledgement of what was happening. Even if either fully grasped it, Valera had read the reports, studied them. Physiology of human males, but standing here in the dimly lit chamber, mere inches from him, she realized how little she truly knew. Her mind raced through the procedure she was supposed to follow. It was clinical, detailed, step by step, designed to ensure the survival of her species, yet her heart pounded in her chest, betraying the cold logic she tried to cling to. She felt vulnerable, exposed. But it wasn't just her vulnerability that unsettled her, it was the way he looked at her, not with fear or anger, but with a kind of curiosity, a rawness that stirred something deep within her. Are you sure? He asked, his voice low, as if he could sense her hesitation. Valera swallowed hard, her throat tight. This is necessary, she whispered, though the conviction in her voice faltered. For my people, for survival. He studied her face for a long moment, his eyes softening slightly. And for you? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication she wasn't ready to face. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. What was this to her? An obligation, a duty, or something more she couldn't deny? The strange pull she felt toward him, the way his presence seemed to unravel her carefully constructed walls before she could answer. He moved closer, their bodies nearly touching now. His breath was warm against her skin, and she could feel the strength of his frame just inches away. Valera's heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She wasn't supposed to feel like this, not with a human, and yet the moment stretched between them, thick with anticipation, a tension that neither could ignore. His hands, large and callous, settled on her hips, his grip firm but not forceful. She gasped at the contact, her body reacting in ways that sent heat flooding through her veins. She could feel his pulse through the tips of his fingers, a steady rhythm that matched her own racing heart. He leaned in closer, his lips rushing against the shell of her ear. Tell me to stop, and I will, he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. Valera's mind screamed for control, for logic, for the procedure she had spent so long preparing for, but her body, betraying every rational thought, leaned into his touch. Her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't speak. Her words were lost, tangled in the storm of emotions and sensations crashing through her eye. Her voice caught, and she closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his presence surround her. The air between them thickened, charged with a raw, untamed energy that neither of them could contain. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her hands, placing them on his chest. The skin beneath her palms was warm, firm, every muscle tense with anticipation. She could feel the faint thrum of his heartbeat beneath her touch, strong and steady, grounding her in the moment. Her fingers curled slightly, tracking the contours of his body, feeling the sinewy strength of his frame, every detail of his form, the hardness of his chest. The ridges of his abdomen was so different from her own, so human. She had never touched another being like this before, had never allowed herself to feel this deeply. The human exhaled softly, his hands sliding up her sides, his fingers brushing the fabric of her uniform. Valera shivered at the contact, the friction sending sparks of electricity through her. She could feel every inch of it. Him, every movement, every breath, as if their bodies were attuned to each other in a way that defied logic. Her pulse raced, her skin burning where his fingers roamed. There was no turning back now. That experiment had begun, not with sterile instruments or clinical procedures, but with the raw, undeniable connection that pulsed between them. Valera leaned forward, her lips hovering inches from his. Her mind screamed for restraint, for control, but her body moved of its own accord. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and inviting, and her heart pounded in her chest with a force that left her breathless. And then, in a moment of clarity, she closed the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration of the Unknown, his lips were soft yet firm, pressing against hers in a way that sent a rush of heat through her entire body. Valera's eyes fluttered closed as she surrendered to the sensation, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles as they moved in sync. His response was immediate, his hands pulling her closer, eliminating the space between them. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. Every movement, every touch seemed to ignite a fire between them, one that neither could extinguish. Her body pressed against his, their heartbeats sinking the tension that had built up over the last several minutes, finally breaking free. Valera felt a warmth bloom inside her, spreading through her chest and lower, pooling in her stomach with an intensity that made her gasp against his lips. She had never felt this before, this kind of raw, visceral need. It overwhelmed her senses, drowning out everything but him, the feel of his skin, the taste of his mouth, the sound of his breath mingling with hers. He pulled back for a moment, his forehead resting against hers as they both panted, trying to catch their breath. His hands gripped her waist, his thumbs rubbing small circles into her skin, grounding her in the moment. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice husky and low, his breath hot against her lips. Valera opened her eyes, staring into his. The storm of emotions that swirled within her was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper, yes, with that simple word. The floodgates opened. He moved with a sudden urgency, his hands slipping beneath the fabric of her uniform, exploring the smooth skin underneath. His touch was rough but careful, sending shivers of pleasure through her with every stroke. She arched into him, her body responding instinctively to that sensation, her mind clouded with need. He lifted her effortlessly, his strength both surprising and exhilarating. Valera wrapped her legs around his waist, her fingers digging into his shoulders as he pressed her back against the cold metal wall. The contrast between the cool surface and the heat of his body was electrifying, heightening every sensation twofold. His lips found her neck, trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses along her skin, leaving a burning path in their wake. Valera moaned softly, her head tilting back as she gave herself over to the moment, the feelings too intense to resist. Her heart pounded in her chest as his hands exploded her body, each touch sending ripples of pleasure through her. She could feel the tension building between them, the inevitable climax drawing closer with every passing second. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch on for an eternity, he entered her. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. There was not hesitation, no barrier between them now. It was raw, primal, and overwhelming. Valera's breath caught in her throat as her body adjusted to the feel of him inside her, her nerves alike with the intensity of the moment. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his skin, her body trembling with the force of the connection between them. Every movement, every touch sent waves of pleasure crashing over her, drowning out everything but the two of them. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped, the world fading away until only they remained. The boundaries between them dissolved, their bodies moving together in a rhythm as old as time itself. Valera's mind was a whirlwind of emotions and sensations, each more intense than the last. She had never imagined it would feel like this, so raw, so consuming. But as they moved together, she realized something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about duty or obligation. It was about them. Valera lay still in the aftermath, her chest heaving, her body trembling with the echoes of their shared experience. The dim light of the chamber flickered, casting shadows that danced across the cold walls. The human Caleb remained close, his warmth still radiating through her, their bodies entangled in the aftermath of their union. His hand rested gently on her waist, his breath still uneven as he recovered for a moment. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Each heartbeat, each breath measured against the enormity of the ACT they had shared. Valera's mind raced, but the emotions flooding through her made it impossible to think clearly. It had been an experiment, one she had prepared for, but this was different. It had felt too real, too raw, as if the boundaries between them had been shattered, and now there was no turning back. Her heart pounded against her rib cage louder than Ever as the reality of what had happened sank in, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. It had been an experiment, a clinical procedure for the survival of her race. She had convinced herself it would be mechanical, distant, but now lying in Caleb's arms, she realized how foolish that had been. The connection between them, the intensity of it had shaken her to her core. Caleb's voice was soft, his words hesitant. Unsure, he shifted beside her, propping himself up on his elbows so he could look down at her. His eyes were searching, filled with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. What happens now? Valera closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, her thought swirling like a storm. What did happen now? Her mission had been clear: use that human male, ensure the continuation of her species, and report back. But it didn't feel that simple anymore. The cold detachment she had tried to maintain had melted away during their union, replaced by something far more complicated. She could still feel the warmth of his skin against hers, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and the connection that pulsed between them. She took a deep breath, her voice wavering as she spoke. I don't know, she admitted, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. This wasn't supposed to feel like this. Caleb's brow furrowed, his gaze never leaving her face. You're telling me this was all part of some plan? There was no anger in his voice, just confusion and perhaps a hint of hurt. I don't understand why me? Valera opened her eyes and turned her head to meet his gaze. She could see the questions burning behind those eyes. That KN for answers. She owed him the truth, no matter how difficult it would be to explain. My people, the Eason, were dying, she began, her voice quiet but steady. Our reproduction systems have failed, and no matter what we try, we can't sustain our race. We discovered that humans, specifically human males, are compatible with our physiology in a way we never anticipated. Your species holds the key to our survival. She paused, searching his face for a reaction. Caleb didn't pull away, but the weight of her words settled over him like a heavy cloak. His expression darkened slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. This was supposed to be an experiment, a necessary act to ensure the future of my people. I thought I could approach a clinically detached, she said, her voice growing softer, but I wasn't prepared for. Her voice trailed off, her gaze dropping to the floor as she struggled to find the right words. Wasn't prepared for you. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, his hand still resting on her waist, his touch gentle. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. So this was all for reproduction, to save your race? His voice was calm, but there was a note of disbelief that she couldn't ignore. Valera nodded slowly, feeling a pang of guilt as she spoke. Yes, but it became more than that. She hesitated, her throat tightening as the truth of her feelings surfaced. I wasn't expecting to feel anything. I wasn't expecting you. Here shifted closer, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. And now he whispered, his voice barely audible. Valera closed her eyes, her heart aching with the uncertainty that gnawed at her. The future she had planned, the mission she had been given, all of it felt distant, now irrelevant in the face of what she had just experienced. She couldn't deny the connection between them, the way her body had responded to him, not just as part of the experiment, but on a deeper emotional level. But her people still needed her. The weight of her responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy burden she couldn't shake. I don't know, she admitted, again, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what happens now. Caleb's hand moved up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. You have a choice, Valera, he said gently. You don't have to go through with whatever plan your people had. You don't have to be what they expect you to be. Valera opened her eyes and met his gaze once more. His words lingered in the air, offering her a glimmer of something she hadn't considered before: freedom, the possibility of a different path, one where she could choose her own fate, where she wasn't bound by the expectations of her race. But was that even possible? Could she abandon her people? Could she forsake her duty for the sake of what she had felt in this moment? The questions swirled in her mind, each one pulling her in a different direction. You don't understand, she said, her voice thick with emotion. If I don't return with the results, if I don't fulfill my mission, my people will die. I'll be condemning them to extinction. Caleb's brow furrowed and he sat up slightly, his expression serious and About you? He asked softly. What about what you want are you willing to? Sacrifice everything for a future that isn't even guaranteed. The question hit her like a punch to the chest, knocking the wind from her lungs. What did she want for so long? Her focus had been on her people, on their survival, that she hadn't allowed herself to consider her own desires. But now with Caleb here, his touch still lingering on her skin, she couldn't deny the part of her that longed for something more. Valera pushed herself up, sitting beside him now, her hands resting in her lap. She stared at the floor, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know what I want anymore. Caleb reached out, his fingers gently brushing against hers. You don't have to decide right now, he said, his voice reassuring, but whatever happens, just know that you have a choice. You don't have to do this alone. That sincerity in his words touched something deep inside her, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to feel a sliver of hope. Could she truly choose her own path? Could she find a way to save her people without losing herself in the process? Valera looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was the same quiet strength that had drawn her to him in the first place. His presence was a steadying force, grounding her in the chaos of her thoughts. Maybe there's another way, she murmured, the words barely forming as the idea took root in her mind. Maybe we can find a solution together. Caleb smiled softly, his hand squeezing hers. We'll figure it out, her said confidently. Whatever it takes. For the first time in a long time, Valera allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her people, hope for herself, and hope for the future they could build together. For